All right, so you ready for this? Today we're going deep, really deep, into something that I think a lot of people wonder about, and that's prayer. But not just prayer in the usual sense. We've got some pretty fascinating stuff to work with today. We've got, on the one hand, this really powerful message about prayer from a motivational speaker. And then to kind of shake things up, we're also looking at this book by Matthew Alper called The God Part of the Brain. I mean, just the title alone, right? It makes you think, could it be that this, deep human need to believe in something bigger, something spiritual, is actually, wired into us?
It's a question that's been around for, well, probably as long as humans have, right? And what's really interesting here is that we're not just talking about, theories. We're looking at what people actually experience when they pray and trying to see if that lines up with what we know about the brain. Our motivational speaker talks about how prayer helps them get outside of themselves, connect with something bigger.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling, that sense of awe, of being part of something vast. I know I felt it myself, just looking at the stars or even walking in the woods.
Absolutely. And Alper, the author we're talking about, he suggests that this feeling, this connection, might be tied to something called the collective unconscious. It's an idea from Carl Jung, and it basically means there's this kind of shared pool of thoughts and images and archetypes that all humans have.
So it's like we're all tapping into this universal, spiritual energy. I mean, that could explain why the idea of God or a higher power pops up in so many different cultures and religions, right?
It's a pretty compelling idea, for sure. And if you think about it, this idea of a shared spiritual inheritance kind of makes sense when you look at genetics and how traits are passed down.
Whoa, so you're saying spirituality could be in our DNA? Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about how Alper connects this to the brain.
Well, he argues that there are certain parts of the brain, especially the temporal lobe, that might be involved in creating spiritual experiences.
Wait, hold on. So there's actually a God part of the brain, like a specific spot that lights up when we pray or feel connected to the divine.
It's not quite as straightforward as that. But Alper does bring up some interesting evidence. For instance, people with temporal lobe epilepsy often report having intense religious experiences, especially right before a seizure.
Wow, that's wild. So misfire in the brain can trigger a mystical experience. That makes you wonder if all spiritual experiences are just neurological events.
That's a big question that scientists are still trying to figure out. But I think it's important to remember that just because something has a biological explanation doesn't mean it's not meaningful. I mean, we know that love and joy also have roots in the brain, but that doesn't make them any less real or powerful, right?
That's a good point. It's not about reducing spirituality to brain chemistry, but more about seeing how those two things connect and influence each other. Okay, so we're starting to see how Alper links brain activity to spiritual experiences. What about prayer itself? Our motivational speaker talked about how prayer isn't about asking for things, but about seeking direction and guidance.
And that idea of searching, of seeking, really connects with how Alper looks at the scientific method. He points out that both science and prayer, in their own ways, are about asking questions, looking for answers, and trying to understand the world.
So it's like both scientists and people who pray are on this quest for truth, just using different approaches.
Exactly. And both approaches need a certain humility and acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers.
I like that. It's like we're all on this journey of discovery, whether we're peering through a microscope or looking inward through prayer.
Precisely. And I think that shared sense of seeking, of being open to new knowledge, is what ultimately connects the scientific and the spiritual. And, when we're talking about seeking answers, it's kind of interesting to think about how science has, in a way, debunked some of those old explanations for things, things that people used to think were supernatural.
Oh, you mean like how we now know lightning is just electricity, not like Zeus throwing lightning bolts around?
Exactly. And as science explains more and more about the natural world, it kind of makes you wonder what's left for the supernatural, right? This is where Alper gets into what he calls myths and realities. He looks at some common beliefs about prayer and spirituality and compares those to what science has to say.
Okay. I'm ready to bust some myths. Let's do it. I think this will be super interesting for our listener who gave us both the scientific side from Alper's book and the motivational speaker's perspective on prayer. So what's the first myth we're tackling?
Well, one big one is that prayer is just wishful thinking, a placebo effect that doesn't really have any power.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, even people who pray regularly, might wrestle with that question. Does it actually work in some measurable way?
Well, Alper talks about some studies that suggest prayer might actually have real effects on healing.
Really? How does that work?
It seems like prayer might work by lowering anxiety and stress, and that in turn helps the body's natural healing processes work better. It might not be about some divine intervention, but about putting yourself in a mental and physical state that's better for healing. There's a lot of research now on the mind-body connection and how our thoughts and feelings can impact our physical health.
So it's like prayer could be a form of self-care, a way to tap into the body's own ability to heal.
That's one way to look at it. Now, another myth Alper talks about is that spiritual experiences are proof of a divine being.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about feeling the presence of God or having some other big experience that made them believe in a higher power.
Absolutely. Those experiences are definitely real and powerful for the people who have them. But Alper suggests that these experiences might actually be triggered by a specific brain activity, kind of like how certain drugs or even meditation can create altered states of consciousness.
So instead of seeing a spiritual experience as direct contact with God, it could be seen as a neurological thing happening in the brain.
It's a different way of understanding these experiences, and it leads to another myth that Alper tackles the idea that if science can't explain something, then it must be supernatural.
Oh, right, the God of the gaps idea. Like anything that science can't explain must be evidence for God.
Exactly. But Alper argues that just because we don't have a scientific explanation for something right now doesn't mean it's supernatural. It could just mean that we don't fully understand it yet, or that we need new ways to investigate it.
That makes sense. Science is always moving forward, right? Pushing the limits of what we know.
Right. And Alper suggests that instead of seeing science and spirituality as enemies, we could see them as two different ways of looking at the human experience. Science can help us understand how the brain works and how that's connected to our thoughts, emotions, and experiences, while spirituality can give us a framework for meaning, purpose, and connection.
I like that it's not an either thing. It's more like a both hand. We can appreciate what science tells us without dismissing the value of spiritual experiences.
Exactly. And, talking about science and spirituality, Alper has this really interesting idea of a spiritual gene. He thinks this gene might make humans naturally inclined to search for meaning and connection beyond just the material world.
A spiritual gene. That's fascinating. Tell me more about that.
Well, Alper points to some universal human behaviors as evidence for this spiritual tendency. Things like believing in gods or a higher power, the idea of a soul or an afterlife rituals around birth, death, marriage. These are all themes that keep popping up in different cultures throughout history.
It's like we're hardwired for spirituality, like it's part of being human.
That's Alper's argument. And to explain this, he uses the analogy of a spiritual bell curve. Imagine a bell curve showing the distribution of spiritual intelligence in people. Most people would be somewhere in the middle, with some degree of spiritual inclination. Then you have people at the extremes. On one side, you might have atheists or people who aren't interested in spirituality at all. And on the other side, you have the deeply religious people who experience spirituality very strongly.
So it's like a spectrum, and everyone falls somewhere on that spectrum of spiritual intelligence.
Exactly. And this model helps us understand spirituality in a more nuanced way than just labeling people as believers or non-believers.
It's a helpful way to think about it. It recognizes that spirituality is complex, and there's a wide range of experiences.
Okay, so we have this spiritual gene and this bell curve of spiritual intelligence. How does that connect back to what we were talking about earlier with the brain and spiritual experiences?
Well, Alper believes that this built-in spiritual tendency, this God part of the brain, if you will, might have developed as a way to survive, a survival mechanism. That doesn't seem obvious. How could spirituality help us survive?
Think about it for early humans facing a tough and unpredictable world. The ability to find meaning and purpose, to feel connected to something bigger than themselves, might have been a really important coping mechanism. It could have helped them deal with fear, anxiety, and even the fact that they knew they would die.
So spirituality gave them a sense of hope and resilience when things were hard.
Exactly. And those who were more spiritually inclined might have been better at handling stress, building strong social connections, and ultimately passing on their genes.
That's really interesting. It suggests that spirituality wasn't just some random side effect of evolution. It might have actually been crucial for our survival as a species.
Precisely. And it makes you think, if this spiritual impulse is so deep within us, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves, our place in the world, and the meaning of life?
Those are some big questions. And I think they bring us back to our motivational speaker and their message about how powerful prayer can be.
Right. Alper's research on religious conversion shows that it often happens during times of crisis or when people are feeling vulnerable, like when someone's sense of self is shaken up or they're looking for answers.
Like going through a big life change, a loss, or a time of uncertainty.
Exactly. And in those moments when people are feeling vulnerable, the structure and certainty of religion and the sense of community and support that often comes with it can be really appealing.
So it's not just about the beliefs themselves, it's about the psychological and emotional needs that religion can meet.
Absolutely. It's about finding comfort, meaning, and belonging in a world that can often feel chaotic and unpredictable.
I think that's something a lot of people can relate to, regardless of their beliefs. We all want those feelings of connection and purpose.
We do, and maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. Whether we look at it through the lens of science or spirituality, the human search for meaning is something we all share.
You know, it's pretty mind-blowing to think that something as personal as spirituality could actually have roots in our evolution.
Right. It really makes you rethink those lines between science and religion.
It does, and I feel like this deep dive has brought up so many questions, but it's also opened up some really cool possibilities. Like if we could actually pinpoint the God part of the brain, what would that mean for how we see ourselves in the world?
That's a huge question, and it's something Alper keeps coming back to in his book. If we could isolate the part of the brain that creates spiritual experiences, would that take away from their meaning?
Yeah, would it make faith just a bunch of electrical signals?
Mm-hmm.
Or would, as you said earlier, just help us understand better how the brain and the spirit work together?
I'm leaning towards the second one. Understanding the biology of something doesn't automatically make it less valuable or important. It just gives us another layer of understanding.
I agree, and I think that's what makes this whole conversation so captivating. We're looking at this intersection of two worlds that seem so different.
Yeah.
The objective world of science and the subjective world of personal experience.
That's it. And as we learn more about the brain, we're seeing how connected those worlds really are. Our thoughts, feelings, even our spiritual experiences, they all come from the physical matter of our brains.
It's like we're starting to understand the biological foundation of consciousness itself. And that brings up a whole bunch of ethical and philosophical questions, like if we could manipulate the God part of the brain, should we?
That's a question for the ethicists and the policymakers to figure out. But I think it's important to have these discussions now as our scientific knowledge keeps growing.
For sure. And I think this deep dive has given our listener a lot to chew on, too. Like, how does this new understanding of the brain and spirituality affect their own beliefs and practices?
It's a personal journey, for sure. But I think Alper's work gives us a good way to think about how we can bring together science and spirituality in a way that respects both sides.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the most important thing we've talked about today, that science and spirituality aren't enemies. They can coexist and even support each other, giving us a richer understanding of ourselves and the universe we live in.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. It's an awesome diving into these mind-bending topics with you and our listener today.
Same here. And to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you something to ponder. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and as always, keep diving deep.